All right. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. So this semester is a short semester. The semester that has Ramadan in it is always a short one. So it's a little bit tricky to figure out what to teach in it. I don't like to cancel this semester because of the existence of Ramadan, but at the same time, it takes a little bit of finesse to figure out how to give anything. So this course is going to be 1 out of 3. So this semester is 1 out of 3. This course is going to take a full year. It is prophetic biography, and people are saying, is this the same as Sirah? Technically, but I call it that because it's not. I'm not here to tell you the Sirah as I do, for example, on Saturdays, where I just tell you the stories and kind of reflect on them. Here is an academic study of the science of Sirah and how it worked, and that's a little bit different. So understanding kind of where this science came from, how this discipline functions, and a lot of other aspects surrounding that. So this first part, or the part 1 out of 3, which is what we're going to cover throughout January and February, and maybe we'll have like one last session in April after Eid. We'll cover the pre-Islamic period, the pre-Islamic era. So we'll end this part 1 course with his birth, alayhi salatu wasalam, technique, basically. So we're going to run up, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the context that occurred before his birth, alayhi salatu wasalam. And the second part will be the Mecca period, and the third part will be the Madani period. And that's how I'm going to break it down. This part will be obviously shorter because this semester is only 8 sessions in total, 8 to 9 sessions in total. The other parts will be between 12 and 13. So the objectives for this part is to understand the purpose of the discipline of Sirah, the methods that it is used to benefit Islamic law and Islamic practice, how the discipline was established, because that's very important, understanding the context of the narrations and stories that are told within the books of Sirah, and then understanding the history of Arabia and pertinent parts of the world that matter to the story. When I tell the stories within Sirah, there's a lot of maxims of the times that I skip, that most people who are listening to the story understand, okay, that's how it was back then, but they don't fully understand why or how, but they just accept it so that the story makes sense as we go along. When you study Sirah academically, you have to understand what those contexts were. What was the world actually like back then, and what was the Prophet ﷺ dealing with? What hand was he dealt when he was given his prophecy ﷺ? That requires understanding a little bit of the historic context. Now, I have to be very careful with how much history we go into, because I am a history buff, and I fear that if we get a little bit too caught up into it, I can ruin this whole course for you. So I had to spend a lot of time cutting down what I was going to talk to you about from the historical context and what I was going to leave out. I will share with you resources, obviously, that if you're interested in this piece and you want to learn more, then you can go and you can increase your understanding of the more you understand the context, the more you understand the pre-Islamic era, the more appreciation you have for Sirah. This is a correlation that never fails. The more you understand pre-Islamic Arabia, the more you understand the mentality of the Arabs, their genealogy, their poetry, their wars, their politics, the more you will appreciate every aspect of his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. And the less you understand that, the more foreign his story is to you, which puts a big burden on someone like me when I'm telling the story to try and give you as much context and draw as many parallels so you can actually enjoy the story. But if you understand how it was back then, and you understand the context, it becomes much easier. So I have on the slides the links to the resources, because every semester people struggle with finding the material. So here you don't have to struggle. If you have access, inshallah, if you're in the classroom, the classroom on the website, then you have access to these slides. And on these slides, you can just press the links on these resources. The most important for me is the first one. It's called History of Islam. It's a website that was built by a brother who basically broke down all of the history of Arabia prior to Islam and throughout Islam. And it's in English, and it's comprehensive, and it's a lot of information. I stumbled upon this website as I was doing my prep for this course, and I went through a lot of the points, and it's very reasonable. It's a very good resource for you. I will not by any means be going into the amount of detail that this website goes through, but for sure it's something for you to use. So when you press on it, I think it doesn't come up here, so it's not being shared. That's fine. But it's called History of Islam, and it allows you to kind of read a lot about what happened during his life, but there's a pre-Islamic piece, which is what we're going to be focusing on for this part. And I encourage you to read of that as much as possible. I don't have any mandatory reading requirements for this course, as I did for the previous courses. So this is not mandatory. It's up to you if you want to increase your knowledge on this topic or not. Other resources are Dr. Yasir Qadhi's new Sirah book that came out. I had the pleasure of going through it. It's actually a very nice resource. It doesn't have a lot of pre-Islamic era stuff, but it has enough for it to be helpful to you within this course. Sheikh al-Salabi, this is the book that we studied in university, but we've studied the Arabic version, obviously. This is the translation of it, so you will find a lot in that as well. And then Dr. Salahi's book, which is a very old Muhammad, the Man, the Prophet. It's a very nice book. So these are books that you can use to read to kind of increase your reading. As I've talked about this, in many courses before, when you attend a course in Islamic studies, your proficiency in this discipline won't be based on just attending the course and listening to the lecture, but rather what other readings you do on your own time. Like your proficiency in Islamic knowledge comes from your effort in increasing your understanding of things. We used to attend our durus with the shuyukh, whether they were studying books and to get ijazat or studying just in general. If you had not read the content beforehand and prepared it, it was obvious, and the sheikh would ask you not to come back, basically. He was not there to teach you from scratch. He was there to give you the nuggets and the gems and the pieces of information that you weren't going to find anywhere else, and to explain things to you that you would not be able to come up with on your own. But you would have to be doing the reading on your own. Like you'd have to actually have read the content and done some research yourself to understand it, and then go. I mean, for children, it's different. You're teaching them from scratch, but for someone who's a talib ilm, you should be able to go and do a lot of that work yourself. All right, so those are the resources and those are objectives. Let's get started, inshallah ta'ala. So for this session, I'm going to answer these 4 questions, inshallah, for you. So what is the purpose of studying Sirah? What are the sources of it? When were the first books written? And what do we do with their narrations? Because Sirah narrations are different than Hadith narrations. This is important. It's very important. We have to establish it now, today, so that it's clear for you as we move along within this course, inshallah ta'ala. All right, so a lot of the slides are going to be in Arabic. I'm going to read them and then explain them to you and translate them. Inshallah, I'll be working with some of the brothers to help with translating some of these slides. There's a lot of them, so I think we'll need, you're not going to be able to do it all on your own. We need some people to help out with some of these translations. I'm just way too lazy to sit down and translate all these things and write them. But I will explain them to you in Arabic. All of the quotes that I have for you within these slides are quotes that are pulled out of the main sources of Sirah and the authentic books of Islamic law. I'm just making it easy by putting them all in place for you to kind of read. Why do we study Sirah? There's a lot of reasons. I don't feel like I need to spend too much time on this point. But كان علي بن الحسين رضي الله عنه علي زين العابدين يقول كنا نعلم مغازي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كما نعلم السورة من القرآن. So Ali Zain al-Abidin, which is the Prophet ﷺ's great-grandchild, Ali Zain al-Abidin, one of the few grandchildren of the Prophet, or the great-grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ who survived what happened in Karbala and during that period. So he didn't have a lot of his descendants ﷺ passed away during that period. So Al-Bayt al-Nabi ﷺ numbers were reduced significantly within a week. And amongst the men, Ali Zain al-Abidin was one of the few people who survived and obviously lived on, and he was a great scholar of Islam, and he's one of the great ulama of Ahl Sunnah, and obviously the Shia also seem to be that, but for us he's a great source of knowledge. And he says that we were taught the maghazi, and this is the word you have to keep in mind. When we talk about, I say Sirah, you say Sirah as well, they didn't call it Sirah. It was called maghazi. It was called al-maghazi. Why? Because al-maghazi is the plural of ghazwa. And Ghazwa is a battle. The Prophet ﷺ's life story was broken down for the most part into the battles that he went. Why? You ask? Well, once we talk about the history of Arabia, you'll know why. Once I go through the pre-Islamic era for the Arabs, and we talk about their war, you'll find that the Arabs they knew dates, they knew months and times and years based on wars. It was all about what year this war started, what year this war ended, the days that occurred within these wars. The Arabs were very much oriented towards their battles, and they took a lot of pride in the battles, even if they lost those battles. All that mattered to them was whether they stood their ground during that battle or not. That's all that mattered. Did they show bravery and courage in that battle? Then that's the day that they are proud that they had attended. And if they didn't, then they would never talk about it again. And it didn't matter whether they won the war or they didn't. That was left for the tribal chiefs to enjoy. So they called the Prophet ﷺ Sira al-Maghazi, because it was just an easier way to talk about it. And another reason is because the first 13 years of his life, of his prophecy, the Mecki period, was very scarce with information. Like we don't have a lot of narrations that come from that period. It's hard. If it wasn't for the Quran, a lot of what happened during that period would have been difficult for us to account for. Where we have a lot of narrations and stories starts when he made it to Medina, alayhi salatu wasalam. And then, of course, Badr, followed by Uhud, followed by Khandaq, and then you had Mu'tah, and then you had Khaybar, and you had Tabuk, and all the other Ghazawat and Saraya that happened amongst them. So they were called the Maghazi. And Ali ibn Hussein says that we were used to be taught these Maghazi. We would be taught these battles, just like we were taught the Quran. Just like you memorize the surah of the Quran, you had to memorize the story of Badr and of Uhud because they were of that degree of importance. Imam Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and we'll talk about him inshallah in a little bit, يقول علم المغازي والسرايا, and he would add to the word saraya because saraya is the plural of a sariya, and a sariya so a ghazwa is a battle that the Prophet ﷺ attended. A sariya is a battle the Prophet ﷺ did not attend, which is why Mu'tah is a specific battle. They have some disagreements. Is it a Sariyah or is it a Ghazwa? Because he wasn't there, alayhi salatu wasalam. But we'll talk about that when it's appropriate. علم المغازي والسرايا علم الدنيا والآخرة. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, one of the great scholars of our deen, say the knowledge of learning the seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam teaches you the knowledge of dunya and akhirah all at once. وكان إسماعيل ابن محمد ابن سعد ابن أبي وقاص رضي الله عنه يقول كان أبي يعلمنا المغازي ويعدها علينا ويقول يا بني هذه مآثر آبائكم فلا تضيعوها. So the grandson of Sa'd ibn Waqqas, when he's one of the authorities on Sirah, by the way, Imam Ismail, he would say that my father used to teach us the Maghazi, meaning the Prophet ﷺ's battles and his life, and he would have us recite it back to him. Like we memorize it and then have it read it back to us, read it back to him. And he would say, this is the legacy of your forefathers. So do not miss out, do not lose it. Rahmatullah alayhi. Now, so what is the purpose of studying Sirah? Again, all books of hadith, by the way, all of them, starting with the earliest one of all, which is the Muwatta of Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu. The example also of Imam Bukhari, his Sahih, and Imam Muslim in his Sahih, and Imam Ahmad in his Musnad, and all of the Sunan. So Tirmidhi, and Abu Dawood, and Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah, all of them have chapters within them that are called Kitabul Maghazi. Kitabu Siyar. If you go online and you look up one of these books and you look for the chapters, you'll find the chapter of Maghazi in all of them. And usually that chapter is a long one. It's not a short one. Meaning it's page upon page upon page, where the Prophet ﷺ's life events are being documented by the Sahaba and being narrated through the books of hadith. So you find Kitab al-Maghazi wa Siyar in every hadith collection. It helps you understand the Quran. The Quran will continue to be a locked box to you until you fully understand his seerah alayhi salatu wasalam. When I say that, I don't mean just knowing what the battles were, but knowing the intricate details of what he was going through in different periods of his life alayhi salatu wasalam. The more you understand this, the more you comprehend what his challenges were, what the obstacles looked like, within certain times of his life, alayhi salatu wasalam, the more the Quran makes sense to you. Actually, the Quran becomes extremely dynamic when you understand when it was revealed during his life, alayhi salatu wasalam, and what was happening. When I do tafsir, I usually spend maybe half an hour before each surah just explaining when it was revealed and what was happening. What was he going through, alayhi salatu wasalam? Because once you understand that, it makes perfect sense. Now I know why he's telling this story to him. Now I know why Surah Qasas Musa is being told this way in Surah Al-Qasas and then told a different way in Surah Al-Shu'ara, because it was different times in his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. At that time it was still, he was being oppressed. At this time he was preparing himself to actually perform hijrah. So it's a different flavor and different tone in how the story is being told, because he's being prepared for something different, alayhi salatu wasalam. When you read, for example, Surah Tawbah, and you have no context to it, it's very confusing. If you don't understand what was happening, if you don't comprehend that the Prophet ﷺ had signed 26 treaties with all of the Arabs, and he was betrayed over 30 times. Betrayal as in the tribes he signed the treaties with would murder Muslims. Even they would murder them knowing that they were Muslim just to spite him, and he would re-sign those treaties, and then Surah Tawbah said, no more. You don't re-sign the treaty anymore. That's it. This is done. Not another one. No, either they accept Islam or they leave. And then all the surah after that is talking to the Prophet ﷺ and how to deal with the political entities that surround him. If you don't understand that context, then you end up using Surah Tawbah in a very negative way, which has happened already in our history. So we're very much aware of that as Muslims today. And the reason is the lack of understanding of just what is the context of the Quran. It's the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. It helps you understand Islam in general. Islam is almost impossible to understand if you don't know Muhammad ﷺ. You have to know him well. Because Islam, all of it is his life. It's just what all of Islam occurred during his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. Nothing happened after him. There was no sequel to his story, alayhi salatu wasalam, that's worth telling. Like I can tell you stories of things that happened after him, but it's collateral. It's something that can be added on if you're interested, if you're a history buff and you're interested, you can know about. But really, it's just that. The Quran in its totality, in its entirety, was revealed during his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. It's contextual. Again, if the Quran wasn't contextual, then the significance of seerah would have dropped, correct? Like the significance of understanding the maghazi and the saraya and the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ would be much less important if the Quran was handed to him as a book. Here, take it to people. It wasn't. He was given Iqra bismi rabbik, the first 5 verses. That's it. That's the first time. And then imagine, you think about Iqra bismi rabbik alladhi khalaq, it's a line and a half. Now imagine that the rest of the Quran was going to come similarly over the next 23 years. So almost every day, almost every second day, the Jibreel is bringing something. And what he's bringing to the Prophet ﷺ is contextual. It's based on what the Sahaba were asking, what they were going through, what obstacles and challenges they were facing. So the more you understand this piece, the more you understand how Islam functions in total. And a lot of that, which is maybe unclear to people or confusing to people, stops and ceases to be that once you understand kind of what was happening in the background of his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. And there are many, many examples, and I will give them as we go along, inshallah ta'ala. So the sources of seerah, and I just want you to know this because I think it's important. And this, again, studying academically, you should have some understanding of who. So the first one that we know of, who took interest in documenting the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam's life, as in talking about the story of what was going on. Hadith is different, right? Hadith are snapshots, moments, things he said or things he did. Just a moment. Al-Maghazi was-Siyar tells a story. There's a story that's being told. A hadith is just what I did a second ago. Someone says something, he said something back, that's it. Al-Sirah, there's a story. Any story requires a build-up. You have to understand context, what was happening before, what were people like, where did it go, what time it was. In the hadith that I just narrated for you, for example, do you know when it happened? Do you know where it happened? Do you have an idea how long it took? You don't. I don't, because the hadith is just a snapshot, just a moment. The seerah of the Prophet requires all of these details. We have to understand how long and where and the context and the build-up to all of it. So it wasn't something that became of interest to the people who lived it right off the bat because they lived it. Just like right now, you and I are not interested in documenting what's happening. Like documenting what happened over the last year and a bit in Gaza, for example. We're not doing it because it's happening. It's still happening. It's just happened. We've been around for it, so we know it. But we fail to see sometimes that 100 years from now, they won't know. They'll have no idea. These dates will mean meaningless to them. They won't have the context for any of it. So unless it's documented appropriately, and obviously today, documenting history is a little bit actually more challenging, in my opinion, than it was back then, because now, before it was the scarcity of the documentations. Now it's the abundance of it. There's too much. You don't know what to believe. If you were 100 years from now, you can look back at this era and listen to all of the news outlets and all of the comments and all of the tweets and all of the lectures and all of the khutbahs and all of the debates, you would end up with nothing. You have no idea what happened. So it's very difficult. So history, documenting history, is actually a very challenging thing, and it's almost never objective. It's always whatever the lens of the person who is documenting it looks like, right? The seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, it's a little bit different because you have the Quran on one side. You have a book that judges the story. You're reading the story, but you have the Quran here. So if the story starts to go a little bit of, it starts to change lanes. No, the Quran does not support this part of the story, so you have to bring it back again. So the Quran is why we're able to tell his life story, alayhi salatu wasalam, because it always brings things back. It is the bar is set, so we know we have some guidance. There are parameters for it. So the first person to do it was the son of Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan. His name is Abban. Abban ibn, one of the great tabi'een, one of the great scholars of Islam. And he died maybe around 100 Hijri. And he was the first person to actually sit down and start writing things down into sahaif. Because again, back then, it was not as easy for people to document the written word because it was not as abundant in terms of paper. And all that. So Abban was the first person, as far as we know, to start documenting the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. After him, Urwa ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, the son of. So you're seeing it's the second generation. It's the sons and daughters of the Sahaba, right? The Sahaba wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't they do it? Because why would they do it? They lived it. They were there when it happened. They talk about it openly. It's their children who start saying, "Well, I need to write this down. Baba, sit down. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. No, give me 1, 2, 3. What exactly happened?" And of course, that had they not done that, we would have struggled. So, barakallah fihum. They carry a certain degree of importance for us as Muslims. And then Wahab ibn Munabbih, one of the great tabi'een of Medina. And then Shurahbil ibn Sa'd. And then I put and read some of the names. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, radiyallahu anhu. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri died 125 Hijri or 124 Hijri. He is one of the teachers of Imam Malik radiallahu anhu. So Imam Malik learned directly from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and some narrations point that Abu Hanifa also learned from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and he is one of the great scholars of hadith. So when you go to the Muwatta and you go to Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim, you will find that the narration or the chain of Imam Malik from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, from Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar, from Ibn Umar, is one of the golden threads or chains of narration, because Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri is one of the scholars of hadith that are accepted by all scholars of Islam, that whatever hadith he narrates is an authentic one. He's an authentic narrator of hadith. And this is important, keep that in mind. So Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri is one of he helped us a lot, because not only is he a scholar of hadith, so when he narrates to us something on the authority of the Prophet ﷺ, we accept it, we know it's authentic, but he also took interest in documenting what occurred during the battles. So they gave his stories a certain degree of authenticity and importance. And one of the first people who gathered the Maghazi, meaning these individuals, they wrote small essays. Like Abban ibn Uthman ibn Affan wrote about he wrote, for example, very clearly about Hudaybiyah, because his father was in the midst of that. His father was taken to Mecca, and they said he was killed and brought back. So whatever he heard from the people, and Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri wrote about Badr and Uhud very clearly. But each one it was like an essay, just whatever they remembered and whatever they were able to put together. The first person to put it all together was Musa ibn Uqba al-Madani, rahmatullah alayh, and he died in 141 Hijri, and he wrote the book called Al-Maghazi. And this was the first documented book that was ever written about the seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We still have some remnants of that book, but that book throughout the history did kind of get lost. But a lot of these books that came after quote it. So we know that it was written because those who wrote, the second generation of seerah documenters, would quote the book written by Musa ibn Uqba al-Madani, rahimahullah ta'ala. And then a man by the name of Mu'tamir Sulaiman ibn Tarkhan al-Basri, he wrote something called Kitab al-Sirah al-Sahiha, and we don't have anything left of that book at all, which is why I don't talk about it too much. We have nothing left of it, but we do have, again, the quotations within books that were written afterwards that pointed out. Right after that group, so we have Abban ibn Uthman ibn Affan, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, first group. And then Musa ibn Uqba al-Madani, the second group, who actually started putting things together. The group after that is where we have actual books today. Like we don't have, I don't have the scribbles and the essays of Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri that I can go back and look at myself. I don't have those. And I don't have Kitab al-Maghazi that Musa ibn Uqba al-Madini wrote. But I do have what was written by Imam Muhammad ibn Ishaq, who passed away in 150 Hijri. And all of the researchers in the discipline of Maghazi and Saraya and Sir, in the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, they accept that the book that is most trusted within Sirah is the Sirah of Ibn, it's called Sirat ibn Ishaq. And it's a book that you can go and you can purchase. Should you do that? No, you shouldn't. Not until you've studied maybe a full course, this full course on Sirah, and maybe a second level course, and then maybe you study Arabic with Sheikh Janabi for a couple of years, and then you go buy Sirat ibn Ishaq, and then you'll come with a million questions. Because the way that they wrote those books is different than the way we actually serve Sirah to you today. It's very, very different. It's very interesting. If you open Sirat ibn Ishaq, and you start looking at it, it's very interesting. I will show you some pages of it as we go along within the course, but you'll find that Sirat ibn Ishaq has more poetry in it than probably any other book of Sirah in the history of books written about Sirah. It's every second chapter or every second paragraph is maybe a page and a half of poetry. Why? Because for Arab, that's how stories were told. Stories were told through poetry. Most people, they see the poetry, they skip over to the point where it's a paragraph, not understanding that the paragraph is actually is the poetry that they were cared about. That's how the story was known. That's how we were able to say that this actually happened, because a poet said it. The poetry was validated by people who knew it happened and then was spread by them. And that's how we know that this actually occurred, or else it would have died off. And this is, of course, within this course, one of the sessions is going to be just about Arabic poetry and oration. And I'm going to talk about some of the important aspects of that, because it's a very, very central part of Arabian history. And it plays a huge role in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, during his life and well after he passed away ﷺ. So if you buy Surah Al-Ishaq, and I encourage you maybe to download it and just go through it, and you'll see what I mean. You will understand almost nothing of this. You will find it very difficult to go through it, and very difficult to be able to navigate the landscape of it, because of how it's written and the purpose of why it's written. But it is in terms of resources for the scholars of Sirah, those who obviously took care of this discipline for us over the next couple of hundred years from that moment, Sirat ibn Ishaq is the number one resource for them. The second book in importance is Sirat, is called Sirat ibn Hisham, which is Muhammad Abd al-Malik ibn Hisham, who wrote a second book called Sirat ibn Hisham, and he died maybe 80 years later. And what he did, he put together the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ from Ibn Ishaq's book. But what he did was he got rid of a lot of the stuff that you don't need. Like he summarized it, he cleaned it up a bit. He cleaned up Sirat ibn Ishaq and he added to it from other sources that Ibn Ishaq did not have at the time. And today you can also download Sirat ibn Hisham, and it's just as complicated. Like it's just as complicated as Sirat ibn Ishaq. You're not going to be able to go through it, because again, he's someone who died in 213 Hijri. So we're talking 1,200 years ago. Their interest was mostly in what did Hassan say? What did Ibn Rawaha say? What did Fulan say? What did the poets say during these events or during these timings? And that's what you would end up you would find in those books. So that's the fourth the level or the third level. The level after that it comes a book called Al-Maghazi lil-Imam al-Waqidi, and the book called Al-Tabaqat Ibn Sa'd, and a book called Tarikh al-Tabari, and a book called Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya Ibn Kathir, and a book called Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh Ibn Athir. Now, all of these scholars existed at different times, stretched out over the next 400 to 500 years after that level. But these books are the books that many of us, many of those who study in universities, whatnot, will have access to at some point, because they're easier to read, and they incorporate into their books a lot of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that are pulled from the books of hadith. So what is the main difference between the first group of the first two up there and then the ones under? The first two, there are no narrations that are taken from books of hadith. Why? Because most books of hadith were written later, came in a little bit later. But every scholar, like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, will tell the story and they will they will actually put their chain of narration. He doesn't, like Imam Ibn Ishaq does not tell a story saying this is what happened on the day of Badr just out of his, no, he'll say حدثني فلان عن فلان عن فلان عن فلان عن فلان, and then he would tell the story. And then حدثني فلان عن فلان عن فلان, but it's not, these aren't pulled from books of hadith. These are pulled from his personal conquests and him going after that knowledge. Same thing for Ibn Hisham. For the group under, when we talk about Maghazi al-Imam al-Waqidi and Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, no, in addition to what Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham did, they also went and they pulled the narrations that existed in the books of hadith. Like they would pull what's in Muwatta Imam Malik and Musnad Imam Ahmad and Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim and other sources of hadith and add them to the seerah itself. Now we have a mixed style book where there's a hadith, meaning the chains of narration are being held to the standard of a hadith. And then you have stories that have chains of narration but aren't held to that same standard. So now you have a mix of information. And all these books that are there that I have there are important, and these names are important of people that you should know. So what I'm going to go through briefly are who are the main sources of seerah for us from the Sahaba. This is important. We're going to count or maybe 10 of them, right? And why is because it's these 10 people who actually took the time to teach these things. The rest of the Sahaba, most of them did not, for reasons either of passing away early, being busy with making history, whether ruling or being involved in conquests and wars, or being busy with politics, or with teaching other aspects of Islam, like the Quran and the Arabic language. So the scholars or the Sahaba who actually took time to teach the seerah, and where all of the stories of the seerah that we have come from, are the following. So number one is Abu Hurairah. Abu Hurairah is the number one narrator of hadith, and he's the number one narrator of stories of the Prophet ﷺ life. And those who took the knowledge from him, they wrote things down from him. We don't have any of those remnants. We don't have remnants of any of those books that he wrote, but we know that people like Abu Salih al-Samman and Sa'id al-Maqbiri and Abdullah ibn Hurmuz, they would all sit, and these are all tabi'een, who would write down the stories that Abu Hurairah would tell. And Abu Hurairah can only tell the stories that he recalls from the time when he was there. And he accepted Islam late. So he can tell the stories as a first degree account after the 7th year of Hijrah. But he can't tell the story of Badr and Uhud and Khandaq as a first degree account because he wasn't there. He has to tell the stories that he heard from the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr, and Umar and Uthman and Ali, and other people who were actually attending these things. Which is why he's the highest narrator in terms of content, but he's not the most trusted amongst the scholars of Sirah in terms of the quality of it, because he wasn't there for most of these things to be able to give a proper recollection of it. Number two is Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik. And Anas ibn Malik, he commanded his students to write down the aspects of seerah that he would tell. So his hadith was written. Sayyidina Anas, the narrations of his hadith were written, but he also commanded them to write down the maghazi when he talked about the different battles. Because Sayyidina Anas started serving the Prophet ﷺ at a very young age in the early Madani period. So Sayyidina Anas has a recollection of Badr and Uhud and Khandaq. He has a recollection of these times, radiallahu anhu. So offering that information was the first degree account. And Imam Anas ibn Sirin, for example, and Sulaiman al-Taymi and Ubaydullah ibn Anas, these are scholars his son, who took time and wrote down his documentation of the seerah. Number three is al-Bara ibn Azib, radiallahu anhu. He passed away in the 72nd year of Hijrah, and people would sit in his majlis and write things down. And there are more than one narration of him sitting in large groups, and the tabi'in sitting there with بالقصب ورأيتهم يكتبون عند البراء بأطراف القصب على أكفهم. They would take the qasab is what they had for a pen. You would put it in the and they would write on their hands and as he would tell the stories, radiallahu anhu. And of course, Imam al-Sha'bi, who was a very important figure in Islamic history, in Islamic law, one of the scholars of Al-Kufa, the teachers of Abu Hanifa, and many others. His main source of telling us about seerah came from Sayyidina al-Bara ibn Azib. Number four is Jabir ibn Abdullah. And Sayyidina Jabir ibn Abdullah, obviously, many scholars learned from him. Amongst the most notable is Ata ibn Abi Rabah, the Mufti and of Mecca, and Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, who is Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib's son, but from a different lady. So he was not Sayyidatna Fatima Zahra's son. It was from a different lady from Bani Hanifa. He's called Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. And Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Ali al-Baqir. So the descendants of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, which is why if you go to the sources of Seerah for the Shia, you find that the majority of it comes through Jabir. The majority of it comes through Jabir ibn Abbas, the majority of it, because he's one of the sources that is trusted to them. For us, we have obviously many more sources of Sirah that we trust, so we have a larger collections all in all. So Jabir is one of the mukthirin within the Sirah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Number 5 is Abdullah ibn Abbas. And of course, Abdullah ibn Abbas is a central figure within Islamic law, within tafsir of the Quran, within the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, obviously, and within the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And the reason that Ibn Abbas is special is because Ibn Abbas learned all these things from the Sahaba. So he is one of the Sahaba, young Sahaba, who طلب العلم من الصحابة. In a documented manner, meaning we know that Ibn Abbas would spend time with the older Sahaba, memorizing and learning from them, like Sayyidina Umar, and like Sayyidina Ali, and like Sayyidina Uthman, and like Sayyidina Jabir, and like Ubaydullah ibn Abi Rafi'. He would go and he would sit with these people and he would memorize all these stories because he was very young. When the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Sayyidina Ibn Abbas was maybe 12, 13 years old. He was a young boy. So he spent the majority of his life after that. He was not into politics, radiallahu anhu, at all, thankfully. And he just spent time learning from the Sahaba and memorizing, and then taking that knowledge and teaching it to his students. And of course, amongst his very, very well-known students is Sayyidina Sa'id ibn Jubair, radiallahu anhu, and Ikrimah, and Amr ibn Dinar, and Mujahid ibn Jabr, and Qurayb, Abu Rishdain, and all these scholars. All these names are scholars of hadith and scholars of fiqh and scholars of tafsir and of seerah. And it's interesting. There's a narration قال كان ابن عباس يأتي أبا رافع فيقول ما صنع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم كذا ما صنع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم كذا ومع ابن عباس ألواح يكتب فيها. So Abu Rafi', just so you know who Abu Rafi' is. Abu Rafi' is the young servant of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, right? Which is Abdullah, his father, who was struck by Abu Lahab. And because of Abu Lahab striking him, his sister, Abu Rafi''s sister, struck Abu Lahab back and killed him. So when I tell you the story that Abu Lahab hit a boy and his sister came and whacked him all over the head and he got sick and he died, it was Abu Rafi'. Abu Rafi' was the little boy who got hit by Abu Lahab. So Abu Rafi', he was hit because his master, Al-Abbas, was not in the city at the time. And he stayed with Al-Abbas. He Aslam, Abu Rafi', before Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Talib did. And he stayed with Al-Abbas, and he stayed with Abdullah ibn Abbas for the rest. And it's interesting because Abu Rafi' is Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Talib's servant. Abdullah ibn Abbas treated Abu Rafi' as his master. Abdullah ibn Abbas treated Abu Rafi' as if he was his master because he learned everything from him. So even though this person was his father's servant, so technically he treated him as if he was his master. And this is the adab of the ilm that Islam brought to these people. And he would go to him and he would say, what did the Prophet ﷺ do on this day? And what did he do on this day? And he would write down everything Abu Rafi' would say. We don't call Abu Rafi' a source of seerah because himself, he never had halaqat and he never taught, but Abdullah ibn Abbas did. So I'm pointing out the Sahaba who not only learned the seerah and knew it, but they taught it systematically. Meaning they sat in large groups and they had students who memorized these teachings that they were offering. And I know these are like, why this is boring. It's important to understand where seerah came from. Because if you don't understand where it came from, then there's always going to be a little bit of a gap for you to comprehend exactly how this discipline was moved along. Number 6 is Abdullah ibn Umar al-Khattab, and he is obviously and the person who wrote off him was his Mawla Nafi', Mawla ibn Umar, and Sa'id ibn Jubair and Jamil ibn Zayd al-Ta'i. And of course, Abdullah ibn Umar is a very, very strong source of the stories of seerah for us. And Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As is number 7. And he's interesting because he would write things down and he would pass them down to his descendants. So there's a very known chain of narration in hadith where you hear Amr ibn Shu'ayb an abihi an jaddihi, right? So it's who is it? So Amr ibn Shu'aib ibn Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, right? So Abdullah ibn Amr al-As, his son is Muhammad, his grandson is Shu'aib, his great grandson is Amr. Amr is a very important source of hadith for us. Amr narrated a lot of hadith that his great grandfather taught, and he narrated to us a lot of the seerah that his great grandfather wrote down. So this narration, this chain of narration is important because Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As made sure that his son wrote down the stories he told him, and that those sahaif were passed down generation after generation. And then Amr ibn Shu'aib became one of the sources of seerah for us, that taught the generation of tabi'een and tabi'een. Number 8 is Ali ibn Abi Talib, obviously, and his stories go down to his children. So Sayyidina al-Hassan, Sayyidina al-Hussein, and then all al-Bayt al-Nabi alayhi salam, they learned from Sayyidina, from their grandfather, Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib. So a lot of the stories that you have, again, when you look at the sources of seerah for the Shia, it's maybe 3 or 4 people. Ali, one of them, Ibn Abbas, the second, and Jabir is the third. We just have more people. We just have more people telling the story. And what's important to kind of know in history is that the more people telling the story, the more likely you are going to get a proper story. If you only have one person telling the story, then, right, like there's a quote in an Arabic proverb, مين أكذب الناس شاب سافر وختيار ماتوا أقرانه. Who are the most people who lie the most in the world? A young man who traveled alone and came back, and an old man whose all his peers are dead. Because he can just tell whatever story he wants. There's no way to verify anything, right? There's no way to validate if this story is truthful or not. And we have a tendency as human beings not to lie, but to magnify certain events and downplay other events, depending on how we felt about them, right? So this is a problem of historical documentation, is that people tell the stories based on how they felt about the stories, not based on what happened. They don't have the ability. We don't have the ability to actually say it otherwise. Think about if you were to document what happened in Gaza over the last year, and your documentation would not be factual. Would be filled with the atrocity and the apartheid and the oppression and transgression and the hatred and the blind eye that was drawn by others. See, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying from a historical documentation perspective, it's not helpful for me to have that from you. It's not helpful. We need that because I need to be able to judge for myself whether what you're telling me is appropriate, correct, and worthy of what you're saying or not. If it's only one person telling the story, then I'm stuck. I'm stuck with this one person's feeling about this incident, which makes it very difficult to judge it. And of course, Mujahid ibn Jabr and Ata ibn Abi Rabah and Amir al-Sha'bi, all learned from Sayyidina Ali ibn Talib during the time he was in Kufa. And you can know why. And if you look at these names, you'll go, why? How did the Imam al-Sha'bi who was in Kufa learn? Well, Sayyidina Ali, that's where his khilafah was. He was in Kufa for a while. So these scholars got to learn from him and memorize the stories he would tell. Number 9, Amr ibn Hazm ibn Zayd al-Ansari, one of the known Sahaba, the importance of this gentleman is that he wrote down. He was a Sahabi, a young Sahabi. He wrote down all of his recollections, and he gave it, and he passed down these documents to his children. And Imam al-Zuhri, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, is one of the people who got his hands on those documents and learned from it. That's why Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri's testimony here is very important. And number 10, not because she's the least, but because everyone else was a man, say al-Mu'mineen Aisha bint Abi Bakr. In terms of how much she actually told us, she would rank number 2, maybe. In terms of like the amount, she would be only second to Abu Hurairah in terms of the amount of stories that she told us. But in terms of ladies, she's probably the only one who we have. Like there are others as well, like Maymuna bint al-Harith told some stories, Asma bint Umays, Subayya al-Islamiyya said stuff, like Fatima bint Qais. But really, it's very scarce. Like it's not. But al-Mu'minin Aisha, no. Mu'minin Aisha had a lot of students who were male students. And she had a lot of male students who would sit with her and learn from her, radiallahu anha. And because of that, she a lot of the events that occurred, come through her as well. Radiallahu anhu. Urwa ibn Zubayr and Ziyad ibn Abi Sufyan and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And Imam al-A'zami in his book, he wrote down maybe 34 people who also narrated to us the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. I care for you to know these 10 names because almost every story that I tell you in seerah is coming through the memory of one of these people, if maybe not two or three of them. The reason that many of the maghazi are well known is because, for example, the Battle of Khandaq. It's not just Jabir telling the story. It's Jabir and Abu Hurairah and Ali and Ibn Abbas and Aisha. They're all telling the story. So the recollection of all of these people is being put together, and then you're getting a skeleton of where the overlap is. The job of the authors of the Sirah books was to take all of these narrations and see where's the overlap. What do we know for sure happened that everyone is saying this happened? And what is not? What is being told just by one source? And the other sources don't seem to agree or confirm that story, or they're telling a story that's different. And this is why when we talk about Sirah, and we have discussions with our brothers and sisters from other Islamic sects like the Shia, the question is always, well, you have this one story that you're telling, and this is your chain of narration. This is the only chain that you have. We have the same story being told by 5 different people, very differently than the way that you're telling it. And that's a problem, obviously. And then, of course, you go back to the Quran, and you have the bar that everything is held to. And if the Quran is not supporting one of the narrations, then that narration has to be looked back at again. And this obviously was a lot of work, because you can imagine that once that the politicians of that time had some interest in how this story was going to be told, right? The politicians of the time, the Umayyads and the Abbasis, they had some interest in how this story was going to be told, how Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah were going to be portrayed, or how Abbas and Al-Muttalib was going to be portrayed. Like, they cared about these things. So the scholars of Sirah, a big part of their job was removing a lot of these biases. And of course, the Muhaddithin had to do a lot of that as well. The Muhaddithin had to do way more of that. The Muhaddithin had to get rid of tons of narrations that were politically driven. That even though the chain of narration may be authentic, there's something wrong with it, because he would never say that. We know from his life. But in Sirah, it's difficult because there's a search for maybe glorifying someone. See if we can glorify this figure in one of the Prophet ﷺ stories. So they add, and on that day, Fulan said this, and they never said that, nor did they ever do it, but this is helpful for the political. So this was very hard. For the political scene, for sure, during that time, was one of the major challenges for those who wrote the books of Sirah and documented this science and this discipline for us. All right. So I'm going to end with this, inshallah. What is the difference between narrations? I have two quotes, or three actually, three quotes here for you in Arabic that all say the same thing. Inshallah, once they'll be translated, you can read them. But I'll say what Sheikh Akram al-Diya al-Umari said in his book, Dirasat Tarikhiyya, which is a very, very good book. I wish it was translated. It was a very good resource for studying history and Islamic and Sirah. قال إن اشتراط الصحة الحديثية في قبول الأخبار التاريخية التي لا تمس العقيدة والشريعة فيه تعسف كبير والخطر الناجم عنه ليس بيسير. So he talks about if you hold the historic narrations that we have to the same standard that we hold the hadith narrations that we have, then that is going to cause a lot of problems. If the historic narration that you have does not have aqidah in it, meaning it's not introducing a novel aqidah concept, something that is going to affect how you understand Allah and how you understand your theology, or if it's not offering a new hukum, like a ruling that did not exist in the Quran or did not exist in the Sunnah, then that narration you should not necessarily have to hold to the same standard that you hold the hadith narrations to. And the scholars who at one point tried to do that ended up with nothing. Like their Sirah books ended up it was nothing there. Like it lost most of the meat. It left a lot of the stories empty, because we can't imagine that every single story, because the contexts of stories don't get authenticated the same way. The important pieces, the monumental moments, need a certain degree of authenticity, and they have that. But then a lot of the other aspects, the background music, right? The background noise, the color of the trees and where it was, we're not going to have the authenticity for every single narration for that. And if you demand that, then you're going to end up with a lot of empty landscape within studying his life, alayhi salatu wasalam. So my job, for example, when I tell the seerah, is to be careful of what I leave out and what I bring in based on this rule. Based on this rule, as long as the historic narration is not bringing a novelty of aqidah, and is not bringing a novelty of Islamic law or rulings, then you can safely narrate it. You can bring it forward and say, this is in the book of Ibn Ishaq and in the book of Ibn Hisham. And you don't need necessarily to say, well, what is the chain? Is the chain authentic? We don't judge historic narrations in terms of their chain of authenticity as we do a hadith. Why? Because the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is going to be used for generating rulings. It's going to be used for generating law. The seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, at least these parts of it, are there just to draw the picture, to give you, okay, what was going on during this time? What was happening? Who was talking to whom? Who was upset with whom? What alliances were there? What quarrels were going on? That piece is what we don't necessarily use the same standard. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, which is a very famous scholar of hadith and of Islam in general, so when it comes to Muhammad ibn Ishaq, the guy who I talked about, the first source of seerah, كان يرفض رواية محمد بن إسحاق إذا عنعن ولم يصرح بالتحديث ويرفض رواية الواقدي جملة وتفصيلا. So Ibn Hajar, when it came to the narration of Ibn Ishaq, in order for him to accept his narration of hadith, Ibn Ishaq would have to say, قال لي فلان كذا. He couldn't say عن فلان. Now you're probably, if you haven't studied Mustalah al-Hadith, this may sound weird to you. When they building the science of hadith, these details of linguistics mattered. So when the person narrated the hadith, the scholar would ask, what did he say? Did he say حدثني فلان? I was taught in a session by fulan. Did he say قال فلان? That person said that. Did he say بلغني عن فلان? I've been made aware that fulan said this. Did he say عن فلان? It's not the same thing. حدثني, okay, that's a statement that he heard it with his own ears. He was sitting there. عن, I don't know what he means. Was he there? Was someone else there? Did a friend tell him? Is there someone missing in the chain? So that is called عن في الرواية. So Ibn Hajar says, if Ibn Ishaq says عن, I don't accept his hadith. He has to say حدثني. Imam al-Waqidi, who wrote one of the books, he doesn't accept his hadith at all. He does not accept his riwayat al-hadith at all. He doesn't think he has the skill set or the tools to narrate a hadith. He's fine with him telling the same scholar, Ibn Hajar, uses all of the narrations that Ibn Ishaq and al-Waqidi have in terms of seerah. He doesn't mind that. He doesn't mind the fillers within the seerah of the Prophet. He uses them. But when it comes for them to say something specific about the Prophet, no, it's a different level. Because even Ibn Hajar, as all the scholars of Islam, they differentiate between a hadith narration and a seerah narration, a historic documentation. They're different. They're not treated the same way. And that's something that is not new. That's been there for a very long time within our Islamic history. And the final piece here, he just talks about isnad al-jam'i, and this is I forgot to put the right. I'll put the author of this book. Something called isnad al-jam'i. Isnad al-jam'i is a concept in seerah that is important, where it's not about the authenticity of the chain. It's about the number of people who are telling the story. And al-isnad al-jam'i is accepted within historic narrations. We're more interested in the number of people who told these stories rather than going after each level of the chain of each narration. You want to know isnad al-jam'i. Like when we talk about the Battle of Khandaq, I don't care about the specific authenticity for every person in one chain of narration. I want to know how many people talked about the trench being dug. How many people? If you have a collection of people talking about it, then this is accepted by them. If you think about it, where does the concept of the Khandaq exist in the Quran for the Battle of the Trench? Yeah, where does it point out a trench? In the surah, in Surah Al-Ahzab, where does it point out a trench? Does it? It's 2.5 pages of talking about the Ahzab. Does it point out a trench? Yeah, it doesn't point out a trench. So how do we know there's a trench? It's not in the Quran. It's isnad al-jam'i. It's the fact that Jabir and Abu Huraira and al-Mu'mineen Aisha and Abdullah ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Amr all said, yeah, we were there digging it. And when you have 1,000 people telling you the story, which is what we call tawatur in hadith, but it's not the same because it's not tawatur. You still have to know each and every chain. Like you have to know each individual chain. For sila, you don't. You just need a lot of people telling the same story. That this is what's accepted. This is what they were told by their ancestors. This is the information that they were given. When it's of that level, when the number of people that are narrating are of that, you accept these contexts of the stories. You don't use that to accept the details, the monumental moments, the critical points, but you use that for the fillers. You use that for all of the context and the background and the buildup and all that other stuff. Because those pieces will never be narrated through authentic chains of narration. Because no one cares for them. No one cares to take time to narrate authentically just context and pieces in the background. If, for example, you're sitting here, an authentic narration will be regarding specific points I made in the talk. There will be no authentic narrations of the color of the sujjad and the type of calligraphy that was on the wall. That will be whoever says it. Anyone who remembers it. Yeah, I remember what it was like. It was one person, it's fine because it doesn't really matter that much, but it draws the picture, allows us to see the 3D, understand what was actually going on. But what I'm saying, no, that makes sense because this is what really matters. And the same thing for the Prophet ﷺ's life. The pieces that really matter, the Quran took care of that for us. The Quran came and nailed every single important piece. And then the seerah is just adding for us all of the background. So I tell the story of Badr. I always say in Sirah that I can tell you the story of Badr from the recollection of the Sahaba, and then there's the Quranic narrative. The Quranic narrative is different. The Quranic narrative is interested in what the Sahaba felt, said, the good things they did, the mistakes that they made, and how they need to fix those mistakes. That's why a lot of people, when you study Sirah, we don't study it appropriately. We only take the recollection of the Sahaba. They're human beings. They remember what happened from their own personal lens. Right? They don't. The same thing goes for Uhud and all the other moments, and even all the oppression that happened in Mecca. You need to go see what the Quran said about stuff. So when you study Sirah, most of the time you're going to hear the narrations that come from the books, but you really always have to go back to what the Quran said. How did the Quran address these? When you read Surah Al-Ahzab, for example, about the Khandaq, how does the Quran address the Khandaq? It talks about the fear. It talks about the hesitation. It talks about many of them not making the right choice at the beginning. It talks about being very close for everyone, how close it was for everyone to lose their cool. That's what the surah talks about. When I tell you the story, it's different. I'm focused on all these little nuggets, all these little things that happen, specific, what the Prophet said to this person, what this person said to the other person. They're fun. They're really enjoyable. There's a lot of lessons in them. But you have to differentiate when you're studying Sirah between the different levels of narrations and what is appropriate to add in and what needs to be left out. I'll end with that, inshallah. We will put in, inshallah, translation for these. I don't need you to, they're just extra reading for you. I just want you to understand what I explained to you within this lecture, inshallah ta'ala. That's the end of the first session. We'll see you, inshallah ta'ala, next week. Subhanakallah bihamdik, la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Jazakumullahu khair wa barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Um, so you said that like the old books they use poetry, so it's a different like method, huh? Like narrating the seerah. What about like the halaqat when they were actually like the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een when they were like narrating and teaching the seerah?
Yeah.
Is it the same way as we are kind of like teaching it right now?
One second.
Yeah, take time.